My name is Ethan. To understand why 3 simple words from my fiancé almost dismantled everything I believed in, you first need to understand who I am and what I do. My life revolves around structure, literal, physical, measurable structure. I own a company that restores historic buildings. Most people see crumbling walls or sagging beams and think of ruins. I see potential, a story waiting to be preserved, a test of integrity. My world is about foundations, whether they hold or whether they collapse under pressure. I've always believed that if something is meant to last, it should be built on truth, alignment, and integrity. A plumb line never lies. That is why what happened 3 weeks before my wedding struck me harder than any earthquake could. We were sitting together in our small dining room, surrounded by a sea of papers, lists, and contracts, the detritus of modern wedding planning. My temples already throbbed from the endless guest list debates. Emily, my fiancée, sat across from me, pen in hand, tapping it against the paper in a steady rhythm. I had learned to recognize that sound, the overture to one of her carefully rehearsed speeches. "Babe," she began, her tone dripping with forced casualness. "There's one more person I'd like to add." I barely looked up. "We're already 10 people over," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Who is it?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for my gut to tighten. Then she said his name. Daniel. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Daniel. Her ex-fiancé. The man she had been with for 6 years before me. The man she had nearly married. The man whose name had echoed like a ghost at the edges of our entire relationship. I had never met him, but I had heard about him 1,000 times. Romantic stories of youthful passion, tragic tales of missed opportunities, wistful what-ifs whispered in drunken nostalgia. He wasn't just her ex. He was a monument in her past, a relic she had polished so often in her memory that it gleamed like something holy. I set my pen down slowly. "You want to invite your ex-fiancé to our wedding?" Her expression shifted into what I can only describe as therapy speak sincerity. "I need him there, Ethan. It's about closure. I need him to see me happy, to see me moving on. It's the final step in closing that door forever. It's for me and for us. Please, just be mature about this." Be mature. Be mature. 2 of the most manipulative words in the English language. They're a linguistic trap. If you argue, you're insecure. If you object, you're childish. She had framed her demand as a moral test, one I could only pass by surrendering my dignity. I studied her face, her wide pleading eyes, the way her lips curled slightly upward, rehearsed sweetness. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about closure. Closure doesn't require an audience. Closure doesn't need a stage. This was something else, something darker. It was a power play, a declaration that her past still deserved a seat at the table of our future. I could have argued. I could have shouted. But what good is rage to an engineer during a stress test? When you test the weight of a structure, you don't yell at the cracks. You record them. You log the data, and you decide how best to bring it down. So I smiled. A calm, warm, disarming smile, the kind that makes people believe you've surrendered. "Of course," I said softly. "If it's important to you, then it's important to me." Send him an invitation. The relief that washed over her face was instant and almost comical. She threw her arms around me, whispering how I was the most understanding man alive. She kissed me, her phone already in hand, fingers flying to text Daniel the good news. She thought she had won. She thought she had tamed my insecurities with her pseudo-psychology, that I would swallow my pride in the name of maturity. But she had no idea what she had really done. She hadn't just invited her ex to our wedding. She had handed me the detonator. That night, as she hummed to herself while scrolling through flower arrangements, I sat silently beside her, staring at the plans of a cathedral restoration project I had been managing. My mind wasn't on the cathedral, though. It was on Emily, on Daniel, on the foundation I had believed would hold for a lifetime. And I realized with cold clarity, the cracks had already spread too far. In the modern world, we like to think love is a matter of trust and communication. But sociologists will tell you, trust is fragile, and once compromised, it rarely returns to its original strength. What Emily had asked me wasn't just inappropriate, it was seismic. In cultures around the world, weddings aren't just parties. They're public oaths, rituals that bind families, legacies, and reputations. To invite a former fiancé isn't closure, it's contamination. Still, I didn't let my anger show. Instead, I let my training take over. If something is rotten, you don't patch it. You dismantle it piece by piece, safely and deliberately. My mind clicked into gear. not as a groom, but as a restorer, as a demolitionist. Emily thought she had invited Daniel to prove something to herself. She didn't realize she had set the stage for her own undoing, and I quietly had already begun my operation. The morning after Emily's little closure talk, I poured my coffee, stared out the window at the half-finished skyline I was helping rebuild, and made a decision. This wasn't going to be a story where the loyal fiancé swallows his pride and plays the role of supportive background character. No. If Emily wanted Daniel at the wedding, then I would give her Daniel, but not in the way she imagined. For me, revenge wasn't rage. Rage is messy, impulsive. I'm a man of systems, of order. When you restore a building, you don't strike it with a hammer randomly. You examine the foundation, you study the weak points, and you dismantle it in a controlled demolition. That's how I approach this, not as a jealous groom, but as an engineer with a project. My project: expose the rot beneath Emily's fantasy and bring the whole unstable structure down with precision. The first step was intelligence. I knew the basics about Daniel from Emily's stories. She had painted him as a tortured artist type, romantic, misunderstood, the great love she tragically lost. But stories are just plaster on a wall. I wanted the bricks underneath. So I called in a professional, a private investigator I'd used before for business. Discreet, efficient, no questions asked. I gave him Daniel's full name, last known city, and told him I wanted everything: current life, career, finances, personal relationships. Within 48 hours, I had a report in my inbox thick enough to make me laugh. Daniel wasn't the heartbroken soul Emily had preserved in amber. He was married, 2 years in fact, his wife's name, Sarah. A corporate lawyer with a reputation for being sharp, ambitious, and, judging by her social media, fiercely proud of her marriage. There were photos of them everywhere. Vacations in Italy, fundraisers in chic ballrooms, smiling with friends in expensive restaurants. They looked polished, happy, and completely free of Emily's ghost. And then came the detail that made everything click. Sarah's maiden name. Her father wasn't just anyone. He was a senior partner at one of the largest law firms in the state. The same law firm handling the legal side of a multi-million-dollar downtown redevelopment project, a project my company was leading. The world, it turns out, is smaller than people think, especially when you deal in contracts, power, and money. I stared at Daniel's file for a long time, then logged into the wedding planning website Emily and I shared. I scrolled down the guest list until I found Daniel's name. She had already added him, his address neatly typed in, and beside it, a little option: add a +1. My cursor hovered for only a second before I clicked. Into the blank field, I typed her name, Sarah. I found her office address online, entered it into the system, and hit Send Invitation. A beautiful, handcrafted envelope, paid for with my money, was now on its way to Daniel's unsuspecting wife. An invitation to her husband's ex-fiancé's wedding. I could imagine the moment she opened it. The confusion, the sharp questions, the quiet, simmering suspicion, the small but growing crack in their marriage's perfect facade. That was how you begin a controlled demolition. You create the first fracture and let the weight of the structure press down on itself. Still, intelligence wasn't enough. If I wanted this collapse to be spectacular, I needed to protect myself too. Emily and I had a joint account for wedding expenses, into which I had deposited a substantial 6-figure sum. She, meanwhile, had contributed what could generously be described as symbolic. I wasn't about to let her walk away with my investment, so I spent an afternoon with my lawyer, Ben, a man who could find a loophole in a steel vault. Together we went through every vendor contract: venue, catering, flowers, music. Most had force majeure clauses, those act of God provisions that allowed postponement or cancellation without losing deposits. Others had personal ties to my company, businesses that owed me favors or wanted my future contracts. One by one, I shifted agreements, not cancelling, but postponing indefinitely. The wedding would exist on paper, but in reality, it was becoming a ghost. A hollow, ornamental structure with no substance. Meanwhile, Emily was blissfully unaware. She was too busy living in her own theatre, spinning daydreams about the healing conversation she'd have with Daniel at the reception. She even asked me once, with false sincerity, "Are you sure you're okay with all this? I don't want you to feel insecure." I looked at her, smiled warmly, and said, "I trust you completely." Trust. Such a heavy word. In relationships, people throw it around like confetti, but in truth, trust is like a beam in a building. Once it bends, once the fibers inside are damaged, it never fully regains its original strength. My trust in Emily hadn't bent. It had snapped. Still, I wasn't angry. Not outwardly. Emily mistook my calm for acceptance. She didn't realize calm can also be the silence before detonation. As I sat in my office that week, blueprints spread out in front of me. I thought about foundations again, about how civilizations rise and fall. Anthropologists say marriages, like societies, collapse not from outside attacks, but from internal rot, corruption, betrayal, arrogance. Emily thought she was staging a small, harmless drama to satisfy her ego. What she had really done was sign the demolition permit. The stage was being set. Daniel and Sarah were now both part of the play. The wedding was becoming an illusion, a paper house ready to burn. And Emily, radiant with self-satisfaction, didn't notice the gasoline pooling at her feet. I wasn't just planning revenge. I was preparing a lesson about structures, about truth, about what happens when you mistake rot for strength. And soon, the first cracks would show. The invitation must have reached Sarah on a Tuesday, because by Thursday morning, Daniel's name popped up in my phone history. A missed call, then another. He hadn't left a voicemail, and I didn't call him back. Silence in these situations speaks louder than conversation. It forces the other person to stew in their own unease. By Friday evening, I received an email. Short, formal, almost frantic beneath the thin veneer of composure. David, I think there's been a mistake. I received word that an invitation went to my wife. This has to be some kind of oversight. Please call me so we can straighten this out before things escalate. Before things escalate. That was the phrase of a man already standing in the crosshairs of his spouse's suspicion. It meant Sarah had asked questions he couldn't answer. It meant their glossy little marriage had already taken its first dent. I didn't respond. Not yet. I closed the email, leaned back in my chair, and let Daniel's panic simmer. You don't rush a controlled demolition. You let gravity do most of the work. Meanwhile, Emily was deep in her bridal fantasies. Every evening, she would wave colour swatches under my nose, chatter about floral arrangements, complain that the string quartet hadn't confirmed the playlist yet. I nodded, kissed her forehead, and murmured the right reassurances. She believed we were planning a future together. She didn't see that I was dismantling it piece by piece. The cracks widened the following week. I knew because Sarah herself reached out. A sleek, professional email with the precision of a legal brief. Mr. Carter, I am writing to confirm whether my husband, Daniel Hughes, has been invited to your upcoming wedding. An envelope addressed to both of us arrived at my office last week. I find the circumstances curious. Kindly clarify at your earliest convenience. There it was. The lawyer's precision wrapped around a wife's suspicion. The kind of suspicion that doesn't fade once planted. This time, I replied, Mrs. Hughes, yes, Daniel was invited as a guest, given his past connection with my fiancée, Emily. Out of courtesy, and in the spirit of transparency, I extended the invitation to you as well. After all, weddings are celebrations of honesty and new beginnings. Warm regards, David Carter hit send, then sat back and exhaled slowly. It was a polite note, respectful, but inside it, a blade glinted. Transparency, honesty, new beginnings. Words that cut deeper when spoken in a marriage built on secrets. That weekend, Daniel tried again. This time, he showed up. I was in my workshop, an unfinished garage I used for models and sketches, when I heard the crunch of tires outside. Through the window, I saw him. Same face Emily had described so lovingly in her nostalgic stories. Only now older, puffier, dressed in business casual instead of romantic rags. He wasn't the tragic poet in her memory. He was just a man, sweating, anxious, carrying the faint stink of desperation. He knocked, sharp and urgent. David, we need to talk. I opened the door slowly, coffee mug in hand, and gave him a calm smile. Daniel, to what do I owe the pleasure? He didn't bother with pleasantries. Why the hell did you invite my wife? His voice cracked halfway through, and I saw the panic in his eyes. Good. The cracks weren't just in his marriage anymore. They were in him. I sipped my coffee. Why wouldn't I? Emily values honesty. If you were coming, it seemed only right Sarah should too. Don't you agree? That's not... He broke off, rubbed his temples. Look, Emily doesn't need to be dragged into this mess. And Sarah, she doesn't understand. She thinks... He trailed off. I raised an eyebrow. She thinks what? He didn't answer. Couldn't. His silence told me everything. Sarah thought he still carried a torch. Sarah thought Emily wasn't just a harmless ghost. Perfect. I stepped closer, lowered my voice, let just a trace of steel enter my tone. Daniel, let me make something clear. You were invited out of courtesy. Emily wanted closure. That's all. But if your wife interprets it differently, I shrugged as if helpless. Oh, well, that's not my problem. Maybe you should talk to her. Be transparent. His face tightened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He wanted to lash out, I could see it, but he didn't. He turned, muttered something I didn't catch, and stormed back to his car. The engine roared. The tires spat gravel, and then he was gone. I closed the door, placed my empty coffee mug on the counter, and allowed myself a smile. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were spreading, a marriage on one side, a wedding on the other, both fragile, both rotting, and Emily, blissfully, still had no idea. She was rehearsing a love story. I was writing a tragedy. The next act unfolded not with a bang but with whispers. That's how collapse begins. Not sudden explosions, but the faint creak of beams under strain. Emily, radiant with bridal energy, had no idea of the pressure building outside her little stage. She was living inside a snow globe of Pinterest boards and cake tastings. I watched her hum over guest seating charts, while Daniel's marriage quietly began to suffocate. Sarah wasn't the type to sit quietly. That much was clear from the way her email had landed. Sharp, professional, precise. A woman like her doesn't ignore red flags. She investigates them. And Daniel, poor Daniel, had the misfortune of marrying someone who treated lies like cross-examination fodder. I didn't need confirmation. I saw it in the way Daniel's calls came less frequently, then not at all. Silence in a guilty man's life usually means one thing: interrogation at home. Meanwhile, Emily floated. One night, she curled up beside me on the couch, sighing dramatically. "You know," she said, voice soft, wistful, "I think this wedding is going to heal something. For me, for Daniel, for all of us." I turned my head slowly, studying her face as if it were a blueprint with cracks invisible to the untrained eye. "Heal?" I repeated, as though the word amused me. "Yes." She smiled dreamily. "We were all so young, so reckless back then. This is a chance to set things right. Closure, don't you think? Closure." The word was poison, but she swallowed it like champagne. I brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled warmly, letting her believe I was the devoted fiancé. In truth, I thought of her as an architect building a house on sand. Every detail she added, flowers, vows, a closure moment with Daniel, wasn't a decoration. It was more weight pressing down on a doomed foundation. And then, the first external shockwave arrived. It was a Saturday morning when Sarah called me directly. No email, no preamble. Her voice was calm, but beneath it, I heard the quiet edge of controlled fury. "Mr. Carter, this is Sarah Hughes. I'd like to clarify something." "Of course," I said smoothly, leaning back in my chair. "Emily," she continued, "did she specifically ask that Daniel be invited? Or was that your decision?" There it was, the pivot. Not about the wedding, about Emily. Sarah had skipped past her husband's excuses and gone straight for the source of rot. "Yes," I said evenly. "It was Emily's request. She felt it was important for closure." I respected that. Silence. Not long, but long enough to measure. Sarah was processing, and when lawyers process, it's dangerous. "I see," she finally said. "Thank you for your honesty." And just like that, she hung up. I set my phone down and smiled. A quiet domino had tipped. Sarah now carried knowledge Emily didn't know she had handed over. Daniel would face a storm at home he couldn't prepare for. That night, Emily showed me colour palettes for the bridesmaids' dresses. Blissfully unaware she had just armed another woman with ammunition that would eventually be aimed at her. It was almost elegant, the symmetry of it. Emily thought she was staging a story of healing, reunion, and romance. Instead, she was the spark between two fuses, one tied to Daniel's marriage, the other to our own. The illusion of control. That's what Emily was clinging to. She thought she could script this like a romantic drama. But she didn't know I had already written the ending. And very soon, she was going to watch it performed. 2 weeks before the wedding, the venue held its official rehearsal. The hall was a cathedral of glass and steel, one of those modern marvels designed to impress more than inspire devotion. Emily adored it. To her, it wasn't just a space, it was a stage. I walked in with her hand tucked into my arm, smiling at the familiar faces of family and friends who had gathered. Everyone assumed my calm meant confidence. None of them realized I was looking at this hall not as a groom, but as an engineer assessing a doomed structure before demolition. The guest list had already done its work. Daniel and Sarah were both present. They arrived separately. Sarah walked in first, elegant in a fitted black dress, her posture sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel followed 10 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot. Emily lit up when she saw him. Her grip on my arm tightened, just for a second, before she forced herself to let go and wave casually. But I felt that grip. It told me everything. The rehearsal went through the usual motions, the priest's instructions, the order of walking, the timing of music. But the real drama was happening in the glances. Sarah's eyes tracked Emily with surgical precision. Emily, meanwhile, performed a little play of nonchalance, smiling too brightly, laughing too loudly whenever Daniel was near. And Daniel, he was the weak beam creaking under too much weight, sweating, fidgeting, stealing glances at both women and then staring at the floor. During the break, Sarah approached me, calm, controlled, a glass of champagne in one hand. "She's beautiful," she said, nodding toward Emily. "Yes," I replied, voice neutral. Brave too, inviting Daniel here. Most women wouldn't risk complications. Her tone was smooth, but her eyes were knives. I tilted my head slightly, as though puzzled. Emily believes in closure. She thinks old stories need proper endings. Sarah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Endings, yes, though not everyone agrees on what they should look like. She walked away before I could answer, though the truth was, I didn't need to. We understood each other perfectly. Sarah was already dismantling her husband at home. I was dismantling Emily here. Two architects of collapse, working in parallel. Later, as the rehearsal wrapped, Emily clasped my hands and whispered, "See, it wasn't so bad." Daniel was so polite. And Sarah, well, she'll understand once the wedding comes. It's all going to be fine. Fine. She had no idea that the walls were already cracking around her. No idea that every polite smile was just a mask stretched thin over suspicion and anger. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I thought about the symmetry of the situation. Weddings are supposed to be about unions, two lives joining, but this one was becoming an intersection of fractures. Two marriages, two facades, colliding in one hall. Emily thought she was orchestrating a reunion. What she had really built was a fault line, and in less than 2 weeks, everyone would watch it break. 10 days before the wedding, the first visible cracks appeared, not in Daniel's marriage, not in Emily's fantasies, but in the machinery of the wedding itself. The florist called me. "Mr. Carter, we're still waiting for confirmation on the final order. Ms. Emily said she'd send it last week, but..." A pause, careful. "Should we hold or proceed?" "Hold," I said, calm, firm. The florist, like all the others, reported to me now. Emily didn't know it, but every contract she thought she was managing had already been redirected through my lawyer's quiet revisions. She believed she was building a cathedral of roses and candlelight. In reality, she was decorating an empty frame. That night, she pouted over her laptop. "Why hasn't the florist sent me the mock-up? And the caterer hasn't confirmed the menu yet either. It's like everyone's dragging their feet." I kissed her forehead. "Don't worry, love. It'll all come together." Reassurance is a funny thing. People think it's a comfort, but sometimes it's just anesthesia. Meanwhile, Daniel was unraveling in plain sight. He called once more, late at night, voice slurred with either exhaustion or whiskey. "David, please. You've got to uninvite her. She's furious. She's threatening." He cut himself off, breathing hard. "You don't understand what this is doing." But I did understand. Perfectly. His marriage was suffocating, and he was blaming me for tightening the noose when, in truth, Emily had placed the rope around his neck years ago. I let him ramble, then said quietly, "Daniel, if your marriage is strong, an invitation shouldn't matter. If it isn't, well, that's not my problem, is it?" Silence. Then a low, broken, "You bastard," before the line went dead. I stared at the phone a moment, then smiled. The demolition was progressing right on schedule. 7 days before the wedding, Sarah sent me another message. No pleasantries this time. "Mr. Carter, out of professional courtesy, I want to let you know. I will be attending your wedding. Daniel may or may not accompany me. That will be his choice. But I will be there. Sarah Hughes, it wasn't a declaration. It was a verdict. She wasn't just coming to watch. She was coming to testify. 5 days before the wedding, Emily caught me watching her as she rehearsed vows in the mirror. She turned, blushing. "Don't look at me like that," she laughed. "You'll ruin the surprise." I smiled, but behind it my thoughts were elsewhere. She was writing words of eternal devotion for a ceremony that would never exist in the form she imagined. She thought she was weaving silk. I knew it was only spiderweb, waiting to tear. 3 days before the wedding, my lawyer called. Everything is in place. The venue is technically booked, but all deposits are refundable. The caterer's schedule has been cleared. On paper, it looks solid. In reality, he chuckled softly. It's smoke. Smoke. Yes. Emily was dancing through fog, mistaking it for marble. And then, the night before the wedding, the final crack appeared. Emily was already asleep, curled up in satin sheets, dreaming of tomorrow. I sat at my desk, scrolling through my inbox. Among the usual clutter, one email stood out. From Sarah, subject line, for tomorrow. "David, I don't know what Emily told you about Daniel, but I think you deserve the truth before you stand beside her tomorrow. Let's just say you're not the first man she's tried to marry while keeping him on the hook. I'll explain everything, in person. See you at the ceremony." Sarah, I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The demolition wasn't just ready, it was inevitable. Tomorrow the hall would not host a wedding. It would host a collapse. And Emily, smiling in her white dress, wouldn't even realize until the dust began to fall.